The gunshot that took Margaret Zimmerman's husband echoed through the valley just as the sun broke over the Wyoming mountains. And by the time his body hit the ground, she knew her life had splintered into 1,000 irreparable pieces for the second time in her 24 years. She stood frozen in the doorway of their cabin, watching as the bandits rode off with everything they owned, leaving Thomas bleeding out in the dirt. Her bare feet moved without thought, crossing the cold ground until she collapsed beside him, her nightgown soaking up his blood as she pressed her hands uselessly against the wound in his chest. His eyes found hers one last time, his lips forming words that never quite made it into sound, and then he was gone. Just like that. 3 years of marriage, of building a life together in this unforgiving wilderness, ended in the space of a heartbeat. The first time she had lost everything, she had been 16. Her family's farm in Missouri had burned to the ground with her parents and younger brother inside. She had been in town that day, selling eggs at the market, and by the time she returned, there was nothing left but ash and memories. Thomas had found her 2 years later, working as a seamstress in Independence, Missouri, barely scraping by. He had promised her a new life, a fresh start in the Wyoming territory where land was plentiful and hope could grow again. She had believed him because she had needed to believe in something. Now, kneeling in the dirt beside his cooling body, Margaret felt that familiar emptiness creeping back in, that hollow sensation that had haunted her after the fire. But this time, there was something else mixed with the grief. Anger. A deep, burning rage at the injustice of it all. She had fought so hard to rebuild her life, to learn how to smile again, to trust that tomorrow might bring something better than yesterday. And now this. The sound of approaching horses made her look up. For a moment, terror gripped her. Had the bandits returned? But these were different horses, moving slower, more deliberately. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and Margaret scrambled to her feet, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, alone in her nightgown with a dead husband at her feet. The man in front was massive, his shoulders broad enough to block out the rising sun behind him. He had dark hair that hung past his collar, and even from a distance, Margaret could see the thick muscles of his arms beneath his buckskin shirt. His face was weathered and hard, the face of a man who had spent years in these mountains, but his eyes held something she had not expected. Concern. He dismounted with practiced ease, his movements fluid despite his size, and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow managed to be gentle. "We heard the shots. Are you hurt?" Margaret shook her head, unable to find words. The 2 men with him stayed back, respecting the distance, but the big man kept coming until he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Your husband?" he asked, looking down at Thomas. "Yes," she managed, her voice cracking. "They killed him. Took everything and killed him." The man crouched beside Thomas's body, checking for signs of life even though it was clearly too late. When he stood again, his jaw was set in a hard line. "How many were there? 4, maybe 5, I don't know. It happened so fast." He nodded slowly, then turned to his companions. "Jake, ride to Independence and fetch the marshal. Tell him what happened here. Henry, go see if you can pick up their trail while it's still fresh." The 2 men nodded and rode off immediately, leaving Margaret alone with this stranger. She should have been afraid, but somehow she was not. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy that she could not quite explain. "My name is Daniel Browning," he said. "I have a place about 10 miles north of here. Let me help you bury your husband, and then we need to get you somewhere safe." "I don't have anywhere safe," Margaret heard herself say. "This cabin, it was all we had, and now they've taken everything inside, every last thing." Daniel's expression darkened. "Did you see their faces? Would you recognize them?" "I think so. Maybe. Everything happened so fast, but there was one man, the leader, he had a scar across his left cheek, and another one, he was wearing a red bandana." "Red bandana," Daniel repeated, his voice grim. "That would be Charlie Mason's gang. They have been hitting homesteads all through this valley for the past 2 months. Marshall has not been able to catch them yet." Margaret felt her legs starting to shake, the shock finally catching up with her. Daniel must have noticed because suddenly his hand was on her elbow, steadying her. His touch was warm and solid, and she found herself leaning into it without thinking. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked. She could not remember. Yesterday sometime. Maybe the day before. Time had become strange and slippery. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you inside and find you something to wear. Then we will see to your husband." The cabin looked even worse than she had feared. The bandits had torn through everything, overturning furniture, smashing dishes, taking anything of value. Margaret's few dresses had been thrown on the floor, trampled by dirty boots. Daniel picked up a simple brown dress and handed it to her, then turned his back to give her privacy. Her hands shook as she changed, her nightgown heavy and stiff with Thomas's blood. She wanted to burn it, to never see it again, but instead she folded it carefully and set it aside. Waste nothing. That had been the first lesson of poverty, learned young and never forgotten. When she was dressed, Daniel turned back around. He had found a blanket, miraculously overlooked by the bandits, and he held it carefully. "For wrapping him," he explained quietly. "If that is all right with you." Margaret nodded. Together they went back outside. The sun was higher now, warming the air, making the scene somehow worse in the full light of day. Daniel worked efficiently, wrapping Thomas's body with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size and obvious strength. Margaret watched, numb, as this stranger showed more care for her dead husband than she felt capable of in that moment. "Where would you like him buried?" Daniel asked. She looked around their small homestead. 3 years they had been here, and Thomas had talked endlessly about building a proper house, planting an orchard, maybe even starting a family. None of it had come to pass. Now it never would. "There," she said, pointing to a spot near a tall pine tree. He liked sitting under that tree in the evenings. Daniel nodded and began to dig. Margaret knew she should help, should do something, but her body would not cooperate. She stood and watched as this mountain man dug her husband's grave, his powerful muscles working rhythmically, dirt flying with each thrust of the shovel. He worked without complaint, without conversation, just steady, patient labor until the hole was deep enough. They lowered Thomas into the ground together, and Daniel stepped back, removing his hat and bowing his head. "Would you like to say something?" he asked. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? That Thomas had been a good man who deserved better. That she had cared for him, even if the wild passion of storybooks had never quite materialized between them. That she was grateful for the safety he had provided, however brief it had been. "I am sorry," she finally whispered. "I am so sorry, Thomas." Daniel said nothing, just stood beside her as she stared down at the wrapped body in the ground. After a long moment, he began to fill in the grave, and Margaret forced herself to help, scooping dirt with her bare hands since there was only one shovel. The physical labor helped somehow, grounding her in the moment, keeping the panic at bay. When it was done, Daniel used rocks to mark the grave, building a small cairn that would withstand the weather. The sun was nearly overhead by the time they finished, and Margaret realized with a start how much time had passed. "The marshal might not make it until tomorrow," Daniel said, as if reading her thoughts. "And you should not stay here alone tonight, not with Mason's gang still out there." I don't have anywhere else to go, Margaret said. The words felt heavy final. And I certainly do not have money for a hotel in town. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the ransacked cabin. You could come to my place. I have a cabin with a separate room you could use. You would be safe there. Every instinct Margaret had developed over years of hardship screamed at her to be cautious. She did not know this man. For all she knew, he could be as dangerous as the bandits who had killed Thomas. But as she looked at him, at the honest concern in his eyes, at the care with which he had handled her husband's body, something told her she could trust him. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Daniel's cabin was nothing like what Margaret had expected. She had pictured something rough and barely livable, the sort of place a solitary mountain man might inhabit. Instead, she found a well-built log structure with real glass windows and a stone chimney. The inside was clean and organized, with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. A large bearskin hung on one wall, and shelves held books, actual books, more than Margaret had seen outside of a library. "The bedroom is through there," Daniel said, pointing to a door at the back. "I will sleep out here by the fire." Margaret walked to the door and pushed it open. The room held a real bed with a thick mattress, a washstand, and even a mirror. Compared to the rough pallet she and Thomas had shared, it looked like luxury. "This is your room," she said, turning back to him. "I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will," Daniel said firmly. "You have been through hell today, and you need to rest properly. I have slept on worse than a floor in my time, believe me." There was no arguing with his tone, so Margaret simply nodded. She felt suddenly exhausted, as if all the strength had drained out of her body at once. "Thank you," she said again, "for everything. I do not even know how to begin to repay you." "There is nothing to repay," Daniel said. "This is what neighbors do for each other out here. It is how we survive." He busied himself building up the fire and putting a pot of coffee on to boil, while Margaret stood awkwardly in the middle of the room. She felt like she should be doing something, helping somehow, but her mind could not seem to focus on anything beyond the horrible images of the morning replaying over and over. "Sit down before you fall down," Daniel said, not unkindly. He guided her to a chair by the fire, and Margaret sank into it gratefully. A moment later he pressed a tin cup into her hands. "Coffee, and there is stew from yesterday if you are hungry." "I should not be hungry," Margaret said. "My husband is dead. I should not want food or drink." "Your husband is dead, but you are alive," Daniel said bluntly. "And staying alive means eating and drinking. Thomas would want you to take care of yourself." The practical truth of it cut through her shock. Thomas had always been practical, always focused on the necessities of survival. He would think her foolish for refusing food out of some sense of propriety. She sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter, but the warmth felt good going down. Daniel ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her with a spoon. She ate mechanically, not tasting much, but feeling her body begin to steady as the food hit her empty stomach. Daniel moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, not pressing her to talk, just letting her be. Margaret found herself watching him despite herself. He was even bigger than she had first thought, with muscles that bunched and flexed visibly beneath his shirt as he worked. His hair was dark brown with hints of red in the sunlight that came through the windows, and his beard was neatly trimmed, not wild and unkempt like some mountain men she had seen. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard, but they moved with surprising gentleness as he handled the dishes and supplies. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked, breaking the silence. "About 6 years now," Daniel said. "I came west after the war, wanted somewhere quiet where I could think." "You fought in the war," he nodded. "Union Army. 4th year of fighting was enough for any man. I saw things, did things that I would rather forget. When it was over, I just kept riding west until I found a place that felt right. These mountains, they have a way of healing a man if he lets them. Margaret understood that impulse more than he probably realized. She too had been running from pain, from memories that would not let her rest. But the frontier had not healed her. It had just given her new wounds to carry alongside the old ones. "I am sorry," she said. "About the war, I mean. It must have been terrible." "It was," Daniel said simply. "But it is over now and I am still here. That is more than a lot of good men can say." They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence this time. Margaret finished her stew and coffee and Daniel took the dishes without comment. Her eyes felt heavy and her body ached with exhaustion, but she was afraid to sleep, afraid of what she might see when she closed her eyes. "You should rest," Daniel said, as if sensing her thoughts. "I will be right here. No one is going to hurt you, I promise." "How can you promise that?" Margaret asked, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "Thomas promised me I would be safe. He promised we would build a good life here. And look what happened. How can anyone promise anything in this God-forsaken place?" Daniel crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, putting himself at eye level with her. His brown eyes were steady and serious. "I cannot promise that bad things will never happen again. Life does not work that way, and we both know it. But I can promise that while you are under my roof, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. That is a promise I know I can keep, because it only depends on me and what I am willing to do." Something about the certainty in his voice made Margaret believe him. She nodded slowly, too tired to argue anymore. "All right," she whispered. "I will try to rest." She stood on shaky legs and made her way to the bedroom. The bed looked impossibly inviting, and she lay down on top of the blankets, not even bothering to undress. The pillow smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, of Daniel himself, and oddly, that smell was comforting. She expected to lie awake, tormented by the day's events, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, pulling her down into darkness. Her last conscious thought was that for the first time in hours, she felt safe. When Margaret woke, it was dark outside. Firelight flickered through the gap under the bedroom door, and she could hear the soft crackle of burning wood. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was or why her chest felt so heavy. Then memory crashed back, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Thomas was dead. Everything was gone. Her life had shattered again, just when she had started to believe it might hold together this time. She sat up slowly, pressing her hands against her face. She would not cry. What good would crying do? It would not bring Thomas back. It would not restore what the bandits had taken. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. But the tears came anyway, silent and hot, streaming down her cheeks in the darkness. She curled in on herself, pulling her knees to her chest, and let the grief wash over her. For Thomas, who had tried his best to give her a good life. For the future they would never have. For the girl she had been before the fire, before she learned how cruel the world could be. For everything she had lost and everything she would never have. A soft knock on the door interrupted her crying. "Margaret," Daniel's voice was quiet, uncertain. "I heard you. Are you all right?" She wanted to tell him to go away, that she was fine, but the lie stuck in her throat. "No," she admitted. "I am not all right. Can I come in?" She should say no. It was improper to have a man in her bedroom, but propriety seemed meaningless now, and the thought of being alone with her grief was unbearable. "Yes," she said. The door opened, and Daniel's large frame was silhouetted against the firelight. He carried a lamp which he set on the washstand, filling the room with gentle light. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain distance. "I know there is nothing I can say that will make this better," he said quietly, "but you do not have to face it alone. Not tonight." Margaret looked at him through her tears, at this man who was little more than a stranger but who had shown her more kindness in one day than she had known in months. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. "I told you I came out here after the war," he finally said. "What I did not tell you is why I really left. I had a wife back in Illinois. Sarah. She died of fever while I was away fighting, and I did not even find out until 6 months after it happened. By the time I got home, she was long buried, and our house had been sold to pay debts. I had nothing left, no reason to stay, so I left." He looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "I know what it feels like to lose everything, to have the ground disappear beneath your feet and not know how to keep standing. And I know what it means when someone extends a hand to help you back up. A farmer in Iowa gave me food and a place to sleep when I was at my lowest. Never asked for anything in return, just helped because he could. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to do the same for someone else, I would." Margaret felt fresh tears spill over, but they were different now. Not just grief, but something more complex. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. This man understood. He truly understood. "I lost my family when I was 16, she found herself saying. "Fire took our whole farm, everyone inside. I have been alone ever since, even when I was with Thomas. I thought maybe I could outrun it, this feeling of emptiness, but it follows me. It always follows me." "I know," Daniel said simply. Those 2 words held more comfort than any elaborate speech could have. They sat together in the lamplight, 2 people who had known too much loss, finding an unexpected kinship in shared pain. Margaret's tears gradually subsided, leaving her feeling hollowed out but somehow lighter. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding, for not telling me it will all be fine or that time heals all wounds or any of those other empty platitudes people say." "Time does not heal wounds," Daniel said. "It just teaches you how to live with them. The scars are always there, but eventually they hurt less." "Is that what happened with you? With your Sarah?" "Yes and no. I will always love her. I will always wish I had been there at the end. But the pain is not as sharp now. Most days, I can remember the good times without feeling like my chest is being crushed. That is the best I can hope for, I think." Margaret nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. The grief over her family had faded to a dull ache over the years, present but bearable. Maybe someday the loss of Thomas would feel the same way. "You should try to sleep some more," Daniel said, standing. "Dawn comes early and the marshal will probably arrive sometime in the morning." "Will you stay?" The words were out before Margaret could stop them. "Just until I fall asleep. I do not want to be alone right now." Daniel hesitated, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "That was inappropriate of me to ask. Forget I said anything." "No," Daniel said, settling back onto the edge of the bed. "It is not inappropriate. Not after what you have been through. I will stay as long as you need." Margaret lay back down, pulling the blanket over herself. From where she lay, she could see Daniel's profile in the lamplight, strong and steady. His presence was comforting in a way she had not expected, solid and real when everything else felt like it was spinning apart. "Tell me something," she said drowsily. "Something good." "I need to remember that good things exist." Daniel thought for a moment. "There is a meadow about a mile from here," he said quietly. "In the summer it fills with wildflowers, thousands of them, every color you can imagine, and in the mornings deer come to graze there, does with their fawns. It is the most peaceful place I have ever seen. Sometimes I go there just to sit and watch the sun rise." Margaret closed her eyes, picturing the meadow he described. Flowers and deer and morning sunlight. Beautiful, simple things. things that existed whether people were suffering or not. Somehow that thought was comforting. She drifted off to sleep with Daniel's quiet breathing nearby, a gentle reminder that she was not alone. Morning came too soon. Margaret woke to the sound of horses outside and men's voices. She sat up, disoriented, and realized Daniel was no longer in the room. The lamp had burned out, but daylight streamed through the small window. She quickly smoothed her dress and hair as best she could without a brush and emerged from the bedroom. Daniel was at the door, talking to two men. One wore a marshal's badge. The other was one of the men who had been with Daniel yesterday. "Mrs. Zimmerman," the marshal said, removing his hat. He was an older man with gray in his beard and tired eyes. "I am Marshal Hendricks. I am very sorry for your loss. I need to ask you some questions about what happened yesterday, if you are up for it." Margaret nodded and described everything she could remember. The marshal listened carefully, taking notes in a small book. When she mentioned the scar and the red bandana, he exchanged a look with Daniel. "Charlie Mason, like you thought," he said grimly. "That makes 5 homesteads hit in 2 months. We are organizing a posse to go after them. They have got to be stopped." "I am in," Daniel said immediately. "Figured you would be," the marshal said. He turned back to Margaret. "What will you do now, madam? Do you have family you can go to?" Margaret shook her head. "No family, no money. Thomas and I, we put everything we had into that homestead." "The cabin is still standing," the marshal pointed out. "The land is still yours. You could rebuild." "By myself." Margaret heard the bitterness in her own voice. "I am a widow with no resources and no way to defend myself if Mason's gang comes back. How exactly am I supposed to rebuild?" The marshal looked uncomfortable. He clearly had no good answer for her. "She can stay here," Daniel said. Everyone turned to look at him. "Until she figures out what she wants to do, it is not right to turn her out when she has nowhere to go." "Daniel, that is not proper," the marshal said, lowering his voice. "A single man and a widow living under the same roof. People will talk." "Let them talk," Daniel said flatly. "I am not going to put her out on the street because of gossip. She needs help and I am offering it. That is the end of it." Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. When was the last time someone had defended her, stood up for her without asking anything in return? Thomas had cared for her, but in a distant, practical way. This was different. This was fierce protection, and it made her feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. "Is that what you want, Mrs. Zimmerman?" the marshal asked. Margaret met Daniel's eyes. She barely knew this man, yet somehow she trusted him more than people she had known for years. Maybe it was madness. Maybe she would regret it. But right now, she had no other options, and at least this option came with kindness attached. "Yes," she said clearly. "That is what I want." The marshal sighed but did not argue further. He finished his questions and left with promises to keep her informed about the hunt for Mason's gang. Daniel's friend Jake stayed behind to talk quietly with Daniel about the posse that was forming. Margaret moved to the fireplace, feeling awkward and uncertain about her place in this cabin. She was a guest, but for how long? And what would people think, her moving in with a man so soon after her husband's death? The marshal's words about propriety echoed in her mind. "Stop worrying about what people will think," Daniel said, coming up beside her. Margaret jumped, not realizing he had finished his conversation. "I can see it on your face. You are thinking about reputation and scandal." "Of course I am," Margaret said. "A woman's reputation is all she has in this world. If people think I am improper, I will never be able to hold my head up in town again." "Then they are small-minded fools," Daniel said bluntly. "You are a woman who just lost her husband. You need help. I am offering it. There is nothing improper about basic human decency. The world does not always see it that way. Then the world is wrong." Daniel's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "You will stay here as long as you need. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Margaret looked up at him, at this mountain of a man who seemed to have no concern for social conventions when they conflicted with doing what he believed was right. She felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight control she always kept on her emotions. When had she become so worried about what others thought? When had she started letting fear dictate her choices? "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you, again. I seem to keep saying that." "You can stop saying it any time," Daniel said, but his tone was gentle. "Now I need to get ready. The posse is riding out at noon. We will be gone at least 2 days, maybe more, depending on the trail." Fear spiked through Margaret. "You are leaving. What if they come back? What if Mason's gang comes here?" "They will not," Daniel said with certainty. "They hit homesteads, places that look like easy targets. This cabin is too well defended, and everyone knows I am not someone they want to tangle with. Besides, I will leave you one of my rifles and show you how to use it before I go. You will be fine." Margaret wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but she bit her tongue. She had no right to ask that of him. He had already done more for her than anyone could expect. If he wanted to ride with the posse to catch the men who had killed Thomas, that was his choice. The next few hours passed in a blur. Daniel showed her how to load and fire the rifle, how to bar the doors and windows. He made sure she had plenty of food and water, enough to last a week if necessary. He introduced her to his horse, a massive gray stallion named Thunder, explaining that the horse would alert her if anyone approached the property. "I do not like leaving you," Daniel admitted as he saddled up, "but those men need to be stopped before they hurt anyone else." "I know," Margaret said. "I understand. Be careful." Daniel swung up into the saddle with easy grace despite his size. He looked down at her, his brown eyes serious. "Bar the door after I leave. Do not open it for anyone except me or the marshal. If you hear anything suspicious, do not investigate. Just shoot through the window and ask questions later." "I will," Margaret promised. He nodded and was about to ride off when Margaret surprised them both by reaching up and touching his leg. "Thank you," she said one more time, "for everything." "I mean it." Daniel's expression softened. "I will be back soon," he said. "I promise." Then he was gone, riding down the trail with Thunder's hooves kicking up dust. Margaret watched until he disappeared from sight, then went inside and barred the door as instructed. The cabin felt enormously empty without Daniel's presence. Margaret had thought she was used to solitude, but somehow, in just one day, she had gotten used to having him around. His quiet strength, his steady presence, the way he moved through the world with such certainty. Now that he was gone, the silence felt oppressive. She busied herself with cleaning, even though the cabin was already spotless. She reorganized the shelves, swept the floor, wiped down every surface, anything to keep her hands and mind occupied. But eventually, she ran out of tasks, and the daylight began to fade. Margaret lit the lamps and made herself dinner from Daniel's supplies, trying not to feel guilty about eating his food. He had told her to help herself to anything she needed, but years of poverty had trained her to be frugal, to take as little as possible. Night fell, and the darkness beyond the windows felt absolute. Every sound made her jump. The creak of settling logs, the rustle of wind through the pines, the distant howl of a coyote. She checked and rechecked the rifle, making sure it was loaded and within easy reach. Sleep was a long time coming. When it finally arrived, it was fitful and filled with nightmares. Thomas dying over and over, the bandits returning, Daniel falling from his horse with a bullet in his chest. She woke repeatedly, heart pounding, and had to remind herself where she was. The second day was worse. With no cleaning left to do, Margaret was left alone with her thoughts, and they were not kind companions. She kept replaying everything, wondering if there was something she could have done differently. If she had woken earlier, if she had screamed, if she had grabbed Thomas's rifle, would he still be alive? She knew it was irrational. There was nothing a woman in a nightgown could have done against armed bandits. But guilt did not care about rationality. By the third day, Margaret was beginning to worry about Daniel. He had said 2 days, maybe more, but what if something had gone wrong? What if the bandits had ambushed the posse? What if he was lying somewhere hurt or worse? She tried to push the thoughts away. She had no claim on Daniel, no right to worry about him like this. He was helping her out of kindness, nothing more. Just because he had shown her more compassion in 3 days than most people showed in a lifetime did not mean anything beyond basic human decency. But her heart did not seem to understand that logic. Every time she heard a sound outside, she rushed to the window, hoping to see him riding up the trail. It was late afternoon on the 4th day when thunder's distinctive whinny made her look up from the mending she was attempting. Margaret dropped the needle and ran to the window, her heart in her throat. Daniel was riding toward the cabin, and her relief was so intense it almost brought her to her knees. He was alive. He was back. And from the easy way he sat in the saddle, he was not seriously hurt. She fumbled with the bar on the door, finally getting it open just as Daniel dismounted. He looked exhausted, his clothes dusty and stained, but he was grinning. "We got them," he said without preamble. "All 5 of them. They are in the Independence jail waiting for the circuit judge." "You are sure you got all of them, every last one? The man with the scar, the one with the red bandana, all of them. They will hang for what they did." Margaret felt something release in her chest, some tight knot of fear she had been carrying. "Good," she said fiercely. "Good, they deserve it." Daniel's grin faded as he looked at her more closely. "Are you all right? You look like you have not slept in days." "I was worried," Margaret admitted before she could think better of it. "You said 2 days, and when it became 4, I thought something had happened." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, something warm and surprised. "You were worried about me," Margaret felt her cheeks heat. "Of course I was worried. You rode off to chase dangerous criminals. Anyone would worry." "Not anyone," Daniel said quietly, "but I am glad you did. It is nice to come home to someone who cares whether you make it back." The word home hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them seemed ready to address. Margaret looked away first, flustered. "You must be hungry," she said, falling back on the safe territory of practical matters. "And exhausted. Come inside and I will make you something to eat." Daniel followed her into the cabin and Margaret busied herself preparing food. She had made bread earlier, her first successful batch in Daniel's oven, and there was stew still warm over the fire. She served him a generous portion, then poured coffee for both of them. Daniel ate like a man who had been living on trail rations for days, which she supposed he had. She sat across from him, sipping her coffee, and watched him relax by increments as the food and warmth of the cabin worked their magic. "Tell me what happened," she said when he had finished eating. "If you want to, I mean. You do not have to." Daniel leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. "We tracked them for 2 days. They were heading for the Montana border, probably figured they could disappear into the mountains up there. But Jake is one of the best trackers I have ever seen. He found their camp on the 2nd night. We waited until dawn, then moved in while they were still half asleep. Was there a fight? A brief one. They got off a few shots, but no one was hurt, thank God. They surrendered pretty quick once they realized they were surrounded. Now they are locked up tight and the marshal has evidence from all 5 homesteads they hit. There is no way they are getting out of this." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Justice for Thomas," she said softly. "Justice for all of them. Daniel agreed. The families they hurt, the lives they destroyed. It does not bring anyone back, but at least they cannot hurt anyone else. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. Margaret felt something shifting between them, a deepening of the connection that had formed so quickly. She had been in Daniel's cabin for 4 days now, and already it felt more like home than anywhere she had lived with Thomas. The thought made her feel guilty. Thomas had barely been dead a week, and here she was, feeling comfortable in another man's home. What kind of wife did that make her? "I should go back to my cabin," she said abruptly. "Tomorrow. I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." Daniel sat up straighter, his expression suddenly alert. "Why would you do that? You said yourself you have no resources to rebuild." "I cannot stay here forever," Margaret said. "It is not right, and like the marshal said, people will talk." "I already told you what I think about people talking." "That is easy for you to say. You are a man. Your reputation will not suffer, but mine will, and I have little enough to recommend me already. No money, no family, no prospects. The last thing I need is for people to think I am living in sin with a man I barely know." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Is that what you think this is? Is that what you think I am offering?" "No," Margaret said quickly. "No, I do not think that, but it does not matter what I think. It matters what people in Independence will think when they find out a widow moved in with a bachelor less than a week after her husband died. Then marry me." The words dropped into the space between them like stones into still water. Margaret stared at Daniel, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Marry me," Daniel repeated, his voice steady. "If you are worried about propriety, then we make it proper. Marry me, and you will have a home, protection, a future. And people can mind their own damn business." Margaret could not seem to find words. Her mind was spinning, trying to process what he was saying. "You cannot be serious," she finally managed. "You barely know me. I barely know you." "I know you have nowhere else to go," Daniel said. "I know you are brave and practical and stronger than you give yourself credit for. I know I want to help you, and this is the best way I can think of to do it." "That is not a reason to get married," Margaret said, her voice rising. "Marriage should be about love, about wanting to build a life together, not about solving practical problems." Daniel stood and began pacing, his agitation evident in every movement. "You and I both know that is not always how marriage works out here. People marry for all kinds of reasons. Companionship, survival, because it makes sense. Love is a luxury most people cannot afford. So that is what you are offering me. A marriage of convenience. I am offering you safety and security. Is that really so terrible?" Margaret stood as well, anger flaring hot in her chest. "Yes, it is terrible. I had that with Thomas. I had safe and secure and practical. And you know what? It was lonely. It was empty. We lived together for 3 years, and I never really knew him, and he never really knew me. We were companions, partners, but we were not in love. Do you know what it is like to go to bed every night next to someone and still feel completely alone?" The words hung in the air, raw and honest. Margaret pressed her hands to her face, horrified that she had said them out loud. Thomas had been a good man. He had not deserved her disappointment, had not deserved a wife who wanted more than he could give. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should not have said that. Thomas did his best. It is not his fault I wanted something different." Daniel was very still. When Margaret dared to look at him, his expression was intense, his eyes locked on her face. "What did you want?" he asked quietly. "What were you looking for that you did not find?" Margaret shook her head. "It does not matter. That kind of love, the kind in novels and songs, it is not real. It is just stories people tell themselves." "It is real." Daniel's voice was certain. "I know it is real because I had it once. With Sarah. I loved her so much it hurt, and she loved me the same way. When I found out she was gone, I wanted to die too. That is how I know it was real." The honesty in his words cut through Margaret's defenses. She sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "Then why would you settle for less?" she asked. "If you know what real love feels like, why would you marry someone for practical reasons?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He came and crouched in front of her chair, the same position he had taken on that first terrible day. His eyes searched her face, looking for something Margaret did not understand. "Because when I came home and found you worried about me, when I saw the relief on your face that I was safe, I felt something I have not felt in 6 years. A reason to come home. A reason to be careful to make sure I survived. And maybe that is not love, not yet, but it is something. It could become something if we let it." Margaret's breath caught. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Daniel, I do not know what to say." "Say you will think about it," he said. "You do not have to decide right now, but think about it. A real partnership with someone who sees you and respects you. A chance to build something together, not just go through the motions. It might not be perfect, but it would be honest." Honest. The word resonated with something deep inside Margaret. Her marriage to Thomas had been many things, but truly honest was not one of them. They had both been playing roles, going through the motions of what they thought a marriage should be. "I will think about it," she heard herself say. "But I am not making any promises. And you need to think about it too. Really think about whether this is what you want, because I will not marry you if you are just trying to rescue me. I have been the charity case before, and I will not do it again." "This is not charity," Daniel said firmly. "This is two people who have both lost too much finding a way forward together. That is all. No obligation, no debt. Just two people making a choice." Margaret nodded slowly. It was too much to process all at once. Her husband had been dead less than a week, and here was this man offering her a new life, a new chance. It felt too fast, too soon, but also somehow inevitable, as if everything had been leading to this moment. "I need to be alone for a while," she said. "To think." "Of course," Daniel said, standing. "Take all the time you need. I will be outside tending to thunder." He left, and Margaret sat staring into the fire. Her life had become unrecognizable. A week ago, she had been a homesteader's wife with a simple, predictable future. Now she was a widow being proposed to by a mountain man she had known for less than a week. The smart thing would be to say no. To go back to independence, find work as a seamstress or a cook, rebuild her life slowly and carefully on her own. She did not need a man to save her. She had survived before, and she could survive again. But did she want to just survive? Or did she want to actually live? That was the real question. With Thomas, she had been surviving, going through the motions, grateful for the basics of food and shelter, but never truly happy. Daniel was offering something different. Not promises of grand passion, but honesty and partnership and the possibility of something more. Was that enough? Could it be enough? Margaret thought about the past 4 days, about the care Daniel had shown her. The way he had handled Thomas's burial with such gentleness. The way he had stood up to the marshal without hesitation. The way he looked at her, really looked at her, and seemed to see the person beneath the surface. She thought about how safe she felt in his presence, how his quiet strength made her feel like she could breathe again. How coming back to the cabin after seeing him ride up the trail had felt like something important, something real, and she thought about his words. It could become something if we let it. Could it? Was she brave enough to try? The sun was setting by the time Margaret went outside to find Daniel. He was brushing down thunder, the big stallion munching contentedly on oats while Daniel worked. He looked up when she approached, his expression carefully neutral, not pushing for an answer. "I have thought about it," Margaret said, proud that her voice was steady. "And I want to know something first. If I say yes, would this be a real marriage, in every way? Daniel's hand stilled on Thunder's coat. Are you asking if I would expect you to share my bed? Margaret felt her cheeks burn but did not look away. Yes, that is what I am asking. I would want that eventually, Daniel said honestly. But not until you were ready, not until you wanted it too. I am not interested in forcing myself on a woman who is just going through the motions. When we come together, if we come together, it will be because we both want it. The words sent a shiver through Margaret, but not from fear. From something else, something she had not felt in a very long time. Desire, maybe, or the possibility of desire. All right, she said quietly. Then my answer is yes, I will marry you. Daniel's whole face transformed. The careful neutrality melted away, replaced by something open and hopeful that made Margaret's heart skip. Yes. He repeated as if he could not quite believe it. Yes, Margaret confirmed. But I have conditions. I want a partnership, like you said. I want to be involved in decisions, to have a say in how we run things. I will not be decorative and useless. I know how to work, and I want to work. Agreed, Daniel said immediately. What else? I want time. Time to grieve properly for Thomas, time to get to know you, time to figure out who I am in this new life. I will not be rushed. You can have all the time you need. And I want honesty, always. Even when it is hard, even when the truth is uncomfortable. No more pretending, no more playing roles. If this is going to work, we have to be real with each other. Daniel crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He took her hands in his grip warm and solid. Honesty, he agreed. Always. And here is some honesty for you right now. I am scared out of my mind. I am scared I will fail you, that I will not be enough, that I will let you down. But I am willing to try if you are. Margaret squeezed his hands, feeling tears prick her eyes. I am scared too, she admitted. I am scared this will be another mistake, another loss to add to all the others. But I am tired of letting fear make my choices for me. So yes, I am willing to try. They stood there in the fading light, 2 damaged people taking a leap of faith together. It was not the romantic proposal of storybooks, no declarations of undying love or passionate embraces. But it was real and honest, and somehow that made it more meaningful than any flowery speech could have been. We should do it soon, Daniel said practically. Before anyone in town gets too worked up about propriety. How soon can you be ready? Margaret almost laughed. I have 1 dress to my name and no family to invite. I could be ready tomorrow if we wanted. Then tomorrow it is. We will ride into Independence first thing in the morning and find the preacher. Nothing fancy, just legal and done. Wait, Margaret said. What about you? Are you sure you do not want to wait, have something nicer, invite people? Daniel shook his head. I have no family either, and the only people whose opinions I care about are standing right here. Simple and quick sounds perfect to me. They went back inside together, and Margaret helped Daniel make dinner. It felt different now, moving around the cabin together, bumping into each other in the small space. There was an awareness between them that had not been there before, a consciousness of the commitment they had just made. After dinner, they sat by the fire again, but this time Daniel told her stories about his life in the mountains. About the first winter when he had nearly starved because he did not know how to hunt properly yet. About the time a bear had broken into his first, much smaller cabin and destroyed everything. About the neighbors he had made, the few hardy souls who lived scattered through these valleys, and the community they had built based on mutual help and respect. Margaret found herself laughing at his stories, the sound surprising her. When had she last laughed? When had life felt like anything other than an endurance test? You have a beautiful laugh, Daniel said suddenly, his eyes warm. I would like to hear it more often. Margaret felt shy under his gaze, but also pleased. "I will try," she said. "It has been a while since I had much to laugh about." "Then I will make it my mission to give you reasons," Daniel said. It sounded like a promise. That night, Margaret lay in Daniel's bed, knowing he was just on the other side of the door, and felt something she had not expected. Anticipation. Not fear or dread or resignation, but actual anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. She was getting married again. Less than a week after burying her first husband, she was preparing to take vows with another man. By all rights, she should feel guilty, should feel like she was betraying Thomas's memory. But she did not. Thomas would have wanted her to be practical, to do what was necessary to survive. And more than that, some deep part of her knew that what she had with Thomas was never what she had always longed for. She had cared for him, had been grateful to him, but she had never felt this flutter of excitement when he walked into a room. She had never stayed awake imagining what it might be like when he kissed her. The thought made her blush in the darkness. She barely knew Daniel, and here she was, thinking about kissing him, but she could not help it. There was something about him that drew her, something beyond gratitude or practicality. A connection she could not quite name but could definitely feel. Tomorrow, she would become his wife. Tomorrow, her new life would truly begin. Margaret drifted off to sleep with a small smile on her face, unaware that in the next room, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking almost exactly the same thoughts. The ride into independence the next morning felt surreal. Margaret wore her brown dress, the same one she had worn the day Thomas died, because it was the only one she had. Daniel had offered to buy her something new in town, but she had declined. There was something fitting about starting this new chapter in the same clothes she had worn during the last one. A reminder of how far she had come in such a short time. Independence was a small town, barely more than a main street with a handful of buildings clustered around it. The general store, the saloon, the marshal's office, and at the end of the street, a small white church with a cross on top. People stopped to stare as they rode past. Margaret could see the curiosity on their faces, the speculation. News traveled fast in small towns, and everyone would know by now about Thomas's death and about her staying at Daniel's cabin. She lifted her chin and looked straight ahead, refusing to show any shame. Daniel tied the horses outside the church and helped Margaret dismount. His hand on her waist sent warmth through her, even through layers of fabric. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Ready," she confirmed. The preacher was an older man named Reverend Matthews. He looked surprised when they explained what they wanted, his eyes flicking between them with obvious questions he was too polite to ask directly. "This is quite sudden," he said carefully. "Mrs. Zimmerman, you only just lost your husband. Are you certain you want to remarry so quickly?" "I am certain," Margaret said firmly. "I have nothing left, Reverend. Mr. Browning has offered me a home and protection, and I have accepted. I see no reason to wait." "Marriage is a sacred institution," the Reverend continued. "It should not be entered into lightly or for purely practical reasons." "I am not entering into it lightly," Margaret said. "I understand exactly what I am doing and why. Now, will you marry us, or do we need to find someone else?" The Reverend looked at Daniel, who simply raised an eyebrow, clearly willing to let Margaret fight this battle herself. After a moment, the Reverend sighed. "Very well. If you are both certain, then I will perform the ceremony. But I want you to understand that in the eyes of God, this is a permanent commitment." "We understand," Daniel and Margaret said in unison. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like their courtship had been. The Reverend read the traditional words, asked them to make their vows, and declared them husband and wife. There were no rings, no flowers, no guests. Just two people making promises in a small church while the morning light streamed through the windows. "You may kiss your bride," the reverend said finally. Margaret's heart jumped. She had been so focused on getting through the ceremony that she had not thought about this part. She looked up at Daniel, suddenly nervous. He stepped closer, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted. Then his hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle despite his size and strength, and he leaned down. The kiss was soft and brief, barely more than a brush of lips, but it sent electricity through Margaret's entire body. This was her husband now. This mountain man with his kind eyes and strong hands was her husband. When they pulled apart, Daniel was smiling. "Hello, wife," he said quietly. "Hello, husband," Margaret replied and felt her own smile growing. They signed the marriage certificate, paid the reverend, and walked back out into the sunlight as husband and wife. Several people were loitering nearby, clearly hoping for gossip, and Margaret saw more than one disapproving look directed their way. "Let them look," Daniel said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I just married the bravest woman I have ever met. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." No one said anything, and after a moment, people began to drift away. Daniel helped Margaret back onto her horse, and they rode to the general store to purchase supplies. Margaret needed clothes, and Daniel insisted on buying her 3 new dresses, along with undergarments, a good coat, boots, and a dozen other necessities. "This is too much," Margaret protested as the pile of purchases grew. "I do not need all of this." "You are my wife now," Daniel said. "You will have what you need. No arguments." The storekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, watched the exchange with interest. "Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. Browning," she said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely sincere. "Quite sudden, was it not?" "Life is short, Mrs. Patterson," Daniel said evenly. "When you find something worth having, you do not waste time." Margaret felt a ridiculous urge to kiss him right there in front of the disapproving storekeeper. Instead, she simply smiled and squeezed his hand. They loaded their purchases onto the horses and began the ride back to the cabin. Halfway there, Daniel suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. "What is it?" Margaret asked, concerned. "There is something I want to show you," he said, "if you are not too tired." "I am not tired," Margaret said, curious now. Daniel led them off the main trail onto a smaller path that wound through the trees. After about 15 minutes, they emerged into a clearing, and Margaret gasped. It was the meadow Daniel had described to her that first night. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in every color imaginable: purple lupine, yellow buttercups, red Indian paintbrush, white daisies. The morning sun made the dew on the petals sparkle like diamonds, and just as Daniel had said, there were deer grazing peacefully at the far end, does with spotted fawns. "It is beautiful," Margaret breathed. "I wanted you to see it," Daniel said. "I wanted you to know that this is real. Beauty is real. Good things are real, not just pain and loss." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. She dismounted and walked into the meadow, feeling the flowers brush against her skirt. The air smelled sweet and fresh, and birdsong filled the trees around them. Daniel came up beside her, and they stood together in the midst of all that beauty. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, "for reminding me that the world can be lovely." "Always," Daniel said. "That is my job now, reminding you of the good things." They stayed in the meadow for a while, just standing together, watching the deer and listening to the birds. It was peaceful in a way Margaret had not experienced in years, maybe ever. For the first time since the fire that killed her family, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could be happy again. When they finally rode back to the cabin, the sun was high overhead. Daniel unloaded the supplies while Margaret changed into one of her new dresses, a soft blue cotton that actually fit her properly. The brown dress went into the wash bucket. She would clean it, but she hoped she would never have to wear it again. "I was thinking," Daniel said over lunch, "about your old cabin. The land is still yours and the structure is sound. We could fix it up, maybe rent it to someone who needs a place, or sell it if you would rather have the money." Margaret considered. "I do not think I could ever live there again," she admitted. "Too many memories. But fixing it up and renting it makes sense. We could use the income." Daniel repeated, smiling. "I like the sound of that." They spent the afternoon organizing the cabin to accommodate 2 people instead of 1. Margaret's new clothes went into a chest in the bedroom, and they rearranged the furniture to make better use of the space. It was domestic and ordinary, but it felt significant somehow. They were building a life together, one small decision at a time. As evening approached, Margaret began to feel nervous again. This was her wedding night. Daniel had said he would not push her, would not expect intimacy until she was ready, but she could not help feeling anxious about the sleeping arrangements. Daniel must have sensed her tension because he brought it up directly over dinner. "I will sleep out here," he said, gesturing to the area by the fire. "The bed is yours until you decide otherwise. No pressure, no expectations. I meant what I said about waiting until you are ready." Margaret felt relief and something else, something that might have been disappointment. "Thank you," she said. "I know it is our wedding night, but everything has happened so fast. I need time to adjust." "Take all the time you need," Daniel assured her. "I am not going anywhere." That night, Margaret lay alone in the big bed, staring at the ceiling. She could hear Daniel moving around in the main room, banking the fire, settling in for the night. Her husband. The word still felt strange, but less strange than it had that morning. She thought about Thomas, about their wedding night 3 years ago. It had been awkward and uncomfortable, both of them fumbling through something neither really understood. Thomas had been apologetic, and Margaret had been relieved when it was over. In 3 years of marriage, that aspect of their relationship had never really improved. They had gone through the motions occasionally, but there had been no passion, no real connection. Would it be different with Daniel? The thought of his hands on her, of his strength and size, sent a shiver through her that was not entirely from fear. There was anticipation there too, and curiosity. What would it be like to truly want someone, to desire them and be desired in return? But it was too soon. She knew that. Thomas had barely been dead a week. She needed time to grieve properly, time to sort through her tangled feelings. Daniel understood that, and she was grateful. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought that for the first time in years she felt hopeful about the future. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Daniel showed Margaret how he ran his trap line, checking for furs that he would sell in town. She learned to skin and cure the pelts, work that was messy and smelly but also strangely satisfying. He taught her to hunt, to track, to read the signs of the forest. In return, she improved his cooking, introduced some order to his supply storage, and began planting a vegetable garden near the cabin. They talked as they worked, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Margaret learned that Daniel had grown up in Illinois, the youngest of 5 children. He had enlisted in the Union Army at 18, full of idealistic notions about preserving the nation. 4 years of war had stripped away those ideals, leaving him with scars both visible and invisible. His wife Sarah had been his childhood sweetheart, and losing her had nearly destroyed him. In turn, Margaret told Daniel about her family, about her father's gentle humor and her mother's fierce love. About her little brother who had followed her everywhere, always asking questions. About the day she came home to find them gone and the years of barely surviving that followed. About Thomas, who had been kind but distant, a safe harbor rather than a great love. "You think badly of me?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "For marrying him when I did not love him. For marrying you so soon after his death." Daniel was quiet for a moment, whittling a piece of wood. "I think you did what you had to do to survive," he said finally. "Both times. There is no shame in that. You are here alive when you could have given up a dozen times over. That takes strength." "It does not always feel like strength," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes it just feels like stubbornness, like I am too contrary to die even when it would be easier." Daniel laughed, a deep, warm sound that Margaret had come to love. "Well, thank God for your stubbornness then. The world would be poorer without you in it." The simple sincerity in his words made Margaret's throat tight. When had anyone last made her feel valued, not for what she could provide but simply for existing? As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself falling into an easy partnership with Daniel. They worked together, ate together, talked together. He made her laugh with stories about his early days in the mountains, about mishaps and mistakes and learning experiences. She found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, thoughts and feelings she had kept locked away for years. And slowly, almost without her noticing, her feelings began to shift. Daniel was no longer just the kind stranger who had helped her in her darkest moment. He was her partner, her friend, her husband. She found herself watching him when he worked, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the depth of his laugh, the gentleness in his hands despite their strength. One morning, about 6 weeks after their wedding, Margaret woke to find sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and the smell of coffee wafting from the main room. She stretched, feeling better rested than she had in months, and padded out to find Daniel already dressed and making breakfast. "Good morning," he said, smiling at her. "I was about to wake you. It is a beautiful day, and I thought we could ride out to check on your old cabin, see what needs to be done to fix it up." Margaret poured herself coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the mountains in the morning light. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I have been thinking." "About what?" He came to stand beside her, close but not touching. "About us, about this marriage." She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "About the fact that you have been sleeping on the floor for 6 weeks when you have a perfectly good bed." Daniel's expression grew very still. "Margaret, I told you I would wait as long as you needed. I know you did, and I appreciate that more than I can say. But I do not want you to wait anymore." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I want this to be a real marriage in every way." "Are you sure?" Daniel's voice was rough. "I do not want you to feel obligated or like you owe me something." "I am sure," Margaret said firmly. "And this is not about obligation. This is about wanting. I want you, Daniel. I want to be your wife in truth, not just on paper." The transformation in Daniel's face was immediate. The careful control he had been maintaining for weeks fell away, replaced by something intense and hungry. "Come here," he said, his voice low. Margaret stepped closer, and Daniel's arms came around her, pulling her against his chest. She tilted her head back, and when he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the chaste press of lips in the church. This kiss was deep and passionate, full of weeks of restrained desire finally given permission to surface. Margaret melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. His body was hard and warm against hers, and she could feel the strength in him, carefully controlled so as not to hurt her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Bedroom," Daniel said. "Now." He swept her up in his arms, making her laugh with surprise, and carried her to the bedroom. The morning sunlight painted everything in gold as he laid her on the bed, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have wanted this," he said quietly, "wanted you, since that first day if I am being honest, but I would have waited forever if that was what you needed." "No more waiting," Margaret said, reaching for him. "I am ready." What followed was nothing like Margaret's experiences with Thomas. Daniel was patient and thorough, taking his time to learn what she liked, what made her gasp and arch into his touch. He made her feel beautiful, desirable, cherished. And when they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness that took Margaret's breath away. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Margaret's head on Daniel's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. She felt boneless and satisfied in a way she had not known was possible. "That was," she started, then stopped, not sure how to put it into words. "I know," Daniel said, his hand stroking her hair. "For me too." They stayed in bed most of the morning, talking and touching and learning each other's bodies. It felt decadent and wonderful, stealing these hours just for themselves. By the time they finally got up and dressed, the sun was high overhead and Margaret felt like a completely different person than she had been that morning. Over lunch, Daniel kept reaching out to touch her, as if reassuring himself she was real. Margaret found herself doing the same, her fingers trailing over his arm, his hand, his shoulder. It was as if a barrier between them had finally fallen, and now they could not get enough of each other. "We should still go look at the cabin," Daniel said eventually, though he sounded reluctant to leave their little bubble of happiness. "If we want to get it rented before winter." "Tomorrow," Margaret said. "Let's go tomorrow. Today I just want to be here with you." Daniel grinned. "I can live with that." They spent the rest of the day together, moving around the cabin and the property, working on small projects but never straying far from each other. It was like something had clicked into place, the final piece of a puzzle they had been slowly assembling. That night, they went to bed together properly for the first time, and it felt so natural, so right, that Margaret wondered why they had waited so long. But she knew the answer. She had needed to heal, to grieve, to come to terms with her losses before she could open herself to something new. And Daniel had understood that, had given her the space and time she needed. Now, lying in his arms in the darkness, Margaret felt at peace in a way she never had before. She had lost everything twice in her life, had been reduced to nothing more than survival and endurance. But Daniel had given her something that no one could take away. Not bandits, not death, not disaster. He had given her hope. He had given her a future worth fighting for. And most importantly, he had given her a love that felt as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. The next morning they rode out to Margaret's old cabin. It looked sad and abandoned, and Margaret felt a pang seeing it. This had been where she and Thomas had tried to build a life, where they had laughed and argued and made plans, where he had died. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked, watching her face carefully. "Yes," Margaret said, and realized it was true. The grief was there, but it was manageable now, a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. "I can do this." They spent the day assessing what needed to be fixed. The structure was sound, as Daniel had said, but the inside needed work. Furniture needed to be repaired or replaced, the ransacked supplies cleaned up, holes in the walls patched. It would take time and effort, but it was doable. As they worked, Margaret found herself telling Daniel stories about her life with Thomas. Good memories, mostly. The time Thomas had tried to cook and nearly burned down the cabin. The way he whistled while he worked. His terrible singing voice that he insisted on using anyway. "He was a good man," she said, looking around the cabin. "He deserved better than what he got." "So did you," Daniel said. "But we do not always get what we deserve in this life. Sometimes we just get what we get, and we have to make the best of it." "I am making the best of it now," Margaret said, smiling at him. "With you." Over the next several weeks, they spent their days fixing up the cabin. Daniel did the heavy work while Margaret cleaned and organized. They brought furniture from town, patched the roof, replaced broken windows. Slowly, the cabin transformed from a place of tragedy into simply a house, ready for new occupants to fill it with their own memories. Margaret placed flowers on Thomas's grave each time they visited, a small gesture of respect and remembrance. She no longer cried when she stood there. Instead, she talked to him quietly, telling him about her new life, about Daniel, about the future she was building. It felt right somehow, including him in her journey forward even though he could not be part of it physically. By the time autumn began to paint the mountains in gold and red, the cabin was ready to rent. Marshall Hendricks helped them find a young couple looking for a place, newly arrived in the territory and eager for a fresh start. Margaret felt a strange symmetry in that, passing on the hope of a new beginning to someone else. The money from the rental was not much, but it helped. More importantly, it meant Margaret's land was being used, not sitting empty and abandoned. It felt like closure, like the final chapter in that part of her life being written. Winter came early to the Wyoming mountains that year. The first snow fell in late October, and by November, the passes were already filling in. Daniel and Margaret settled into the rhythm of winter life, spending long, quiet days inside while storms raged outside. Margaret had never been so content. The cabin was warm and comfortable. They had plenty of supplies laid in, and most importantly, she had Daniel. They spent their days working on winter projects, maintaining equipment, mending clothes and tack. Their nights were spent by the fire, talking and reading and making love. In December, Margaret realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was just the stress of everything that had happened, but when a second month passed, she knew. She was pregnant. She spent several days trying to figure out how to tell Daniel. They had never discussed children, had never talked about whether they wanted a family. What if he was not happy about this? What if it was too soon? Finally, one evening as they sat by the fire, she simply blurted it out. "I am pregnant." Daniel's hand stilled on the leather he had been tooling. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor. I have missed 2 months and I have been feeling sick in the mornings." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, growing until it was a full grin. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Margaret confirmed, relief flooding through her at his obvious happiness. Daniel crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Margaret, that is wonderful. That is the best news I could have imagined. You are happy?" she asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Daniel said. He put his hand on her still flat belly. "Our child, a piece of both of us." That night they made plans. They would need a cradle, baby clothes, supplies. Daniel insisted Margaret stop doing any heavy work immediately, despite her protests that she was pregnant, not an invalid. They argued about it good-naturedly, but Margaret secretly appreciated his concern. As winter deepened, Margaret's belly began to round. Daniel became even more protective if that was possible. He waited on her constantly, brought her tea and food, rubbed her feet when they ached. It was almost smothering, but Margaret found she did not mind. After years of being alone, of having to be strong and self-sufficient, it was nice to be cared for. In February, a blizzard hit that lasted 3 days. The snow piled higher than the cabin windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. But inside, the cabin was warm and cozy. They stayed in bed most of those 3 days, talking about the future, about their child, about the life they were building together. "Boy or girl?" Daniel asked, his hand resting on Margaret's now prominent belly. "I do not know," Margaret said. "What do you think?" "I think I do not care either way as long as you and the baby are healthy." He kissed her temple. "But if I am being honest, I have been picturing a little boy with your eyes." "I keep imagining a girl with your stubbornness," Margaret said, laughing. "God help us if that happens." "We will manage," Daniel said confidently. "We can handle anything together." Margaret believed him. They had already weathered so much, had built something strong and lasting from the ashes of their individual tragedies. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The meadow filled with wildflowers again, and Daniel took Margaret there often, helping her walk through the blooms even though she was heavy and awkward now, her belly huge with their child. In late May, as the world burst into full bloom around them, Margaret went into labor. Daniel rode like a demon to fetch the midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen who arrived with her bag of supplies and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor. The labor was long and difficult. Margaret had known it would hurt, but the reality exceeded anything she could have imagined. For hours, she labored, Daniel holding her hand and refusing to leave even when Mrs. Chen suggested he might be more comfortable elsewhere. "I am staying," he said firmly. "This is my wife and my child. I am not going anywhere." Finally, as the sun was setting, their son was born. He came into the world screaming his displeasure, healthy and strong. Mrs. Chen cleaned him up and placed him in Margaret's arms, and Margaret felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching his tiny fingers. "We have been waiting for you." Daniel leaned over them both, his eyes wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "You are both perfect." They named him Thomas Daniel, honoring both the man who had tried to give Margaret a good life and the man who had succeeded. Little Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and from the first moment, he owned both his parents completely. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was a demanding baby, wanting to be held constantly, crying loudly when displeased. But he also smiled early and often, and his laugh was the most beautiful sound Margaret had ever heard. Daniel proved to be a natural father. He was patient and gentle with the baby, singing to him in his deep voice, carrying him around the cabin while Margaret rested. He changed nappies without complaint and walked the floor at night when Thomas would not settle. "You are amazing with him," Margaret said one day, watching Daniel make silly faces at their son, who gurgled with delight. "He makes it easy," Daniel said. "Hard to imagine we only get one of him." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we have more?" "Maybe," Daniel said, grinning. "Eventually. If you are willing, I think I could get used to this fatherhood thing," Margaret laughed. "Ask me again when this one is sleeping through the night." But privately, she thought she might like more children too. The cabin that had seemed so empty when she first arrived now felt full of life and love. There was room for more, if they wanted it. As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The cabin they rented continued to provide income. Daniel's trapping and hunting kept them supplied with meat and money from selling furs. Margaret's garden flourished, providing vegetables through the summer and into the fall. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Margaret often thought about how far she had come. From the terrified widow with nothing to her name to a woman with a husband she loved, a son she adored, and a home that felt safe and permanent. The scars from her past were still there, but Daniel had been right. They hurt less now. Most days she could remember her parents, her brother, even Thomas, with fondness rather than aching grief. On Thomas's second birthday, they rode to the meadow for a picnic. Their son, now an active toddler, ran through the flowers laughing, chasing butterflies and picking wildflowers to bring to his mother. Daniel and Margaret sat on a blanket, watching him play. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Daniel asked, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "I remember," Margaret said. "You wanted to remind me that beauty was real, that good things existed. Did I succeed?" Margaret looked at their son, at the man beside her, at the mountains rising in the distance. She thought about everything they had built together, all the love and laughter and simple joy that filled their days. "Yes," she said simply, "you succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined." That fall, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. Daniel was even more delighted than he had been the first time, if that was possible. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring, their daughter was born. They named her Sarah Margaret, honoring Daniel's first wife and beginning Margaret's own healing. Little Sarah was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Thomas had been loud and demanding, Sarah was quiet and content. She rarely cried, preferring to watch the world with serious eyes. Thomas adored his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Margaret's heart swelled watching her children together. The years passed in a blur of ordinary moments that somehow added up to an extraordinary life. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, while Sarah developed her mother's practical nature and her father's gentle heart. They added on to the cabin, building more rooms as their family grew. Margaret never did get used to having enough, to not worrying about where the next meal would come from or whether they could afford necessities. The security Daniel provided, the stability of their life together, still felt precious and fragile sometimes, like something that might disappear if she was not careful. But it did not disappear. Year after year, their life continued, solid and real. They faced challenges, of course. Hard winters, sick children, lean years when the trapping was poor. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel woke Margaret before dawn and led her outside. The early morning air was cool and fresh, and stars still glittered overhead. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, though she was smiling. After 10 years, she trusted Daniel completely, even when he was being mysterious. "You will see," he said. He led her to the meadow, their special place, and Margaret gasped. He had built a bench there, solid and beautiful, positioned to look out over the flowers and mountains. Carved into the back were words, "For Margaret, who taught me that second chances are real. All my love, Daniel." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Daniel, it is beautiful. When did you do this?" "I have been working on it for months, sneaking away when I could. I wanted to give you something permanent, something that would last. So that even when we are old and gray, we can come here and remember everything we have built together." Margaret threw her arms around him, holding tight. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." "You survived," Daniel said simply. "You kept going when anyone else would have given up. You were brave enough to take a chance on a mountain man you barely knew. You gave me a reason to be more than just a hermit hiding from his past. That is what you did to deserve me. You saved me just as much as I saved you." They stood together as the sun rose, painting the meadow in shades of gold and pink. In the distance, they could hear their children starting to wake, their voices carrying on the morning air. "We should get back," Margaret said reluctantly, "before they destroy the cabin looking for us." "In a minute," Daniel said. "I want to remember this, just you and me and the mountains and the flowers. Perfect." "It is perfect," Margaret agreed. "All of it. This life, our family, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, their children's laughter growing louder as they approached. Thomas and Sarah came running out to meet them, both talking at once about something exciting they wanted to do that day. Margaret looked at her family, at the home they had built, at the life that had risen from the ashes of loss and tragedy. She had lost everything twice in her life, had been reduced to nothing but grief and survival. But Daniel had given her something no one could ever take away. Not death, not disaster, not time itself. He had given her love. Real, honest, lasting love. He had given her family, home, purpose, joy. He had given her a future worth living and a past worth remembering. Most of all, he had given her hope, the belief that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, that happiness was not just for other people, but for her too. That evening, after the children were in bed, Margaret and Daniel sat by the fire as they had done thousands of times before. Daniel was carving a new toy for Sarah while Margaret mended one of Thomas's shirts. It was ordinary and domestic, the kind of moment that made up the fabric of their daily lives. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, noticing her watching him. "About how grateful I am," Margaret said. "About how far we have come, about how much I love this life we have built." Daniel set down his carving and pulled her close. "I am grateful too," he said, "every single day, for you, for our children, for this second chance at happiness. I never thought I would have this again after Sarah died. But here we are, and it is real." "It is real," Margaret echoed, "and it is ours. Forever." They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The mountain man and the woman who had lost everything twice. Two broken people who had found wholeness in each other, who had built something beautiful from pain and loss. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. But inside the cabin, all was warm and safe and full of love. The kind of love that endures, that sustains, that transforms tragedy into triumph. Margaret closed her eyes and rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. This was home. This was family. This was everything she had ever needed and more than she had dared to dream. And as she drifted toward sleep, her last thought was simple and true. She had lost everything twice, but in finding Daniel, she had gained something infinitely more precious. She had gained a love that no one could ever take away, a love that would sustain her for all the days of her life and beyond. The end came not with drama or tragedy, but with contentment. Years passed in that cabin in the Wyoming mountains. Thomas grew to be a man much like his father, strong and kind and honorable. He married a good woman and built his own cabin not far from theirs, starting the cycle anew. Sarah became a teacher, bringing education to the scattered children of the territory, carrying her mother's determination and her father's patience into everything she did. Daniel's hair went gray, then white, but his strength never fully left him. He was still chopping wood and checking trap lines well into his 70s, much to Margaret's exasperation and secret pride. Margaret herself aged gracefully, her face lined with the marks of laughter and love rather than bitterness and pain. They spent their later years sitting on that bench Daniel had built in the meadow, watching their grandchildren play among the wildflowers just as their own children once had. The meadow never failed to bloom each spring, a reliable source of beauty in an often harsh world. On a warm summer evening, when Margaret was in her 70th year and Daniel nearing his 80th, they sat on their bench watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Their hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined, as they had been for nearly 50 years. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Daniel asked, his voice rougher with age but still strong. Margaret smiled. "You have asked me that before many times. I like hearing your answer." You wanted to remind me that beauty was real, Margaret said, reciting the familiar words. That good things existed, that life was worth living. And did I succeed? Every single day, Margaret said. For almost 50 years you have succeeded, every single day. Daniel squeezed her hand. Good, he said simply. That is all I ever wanted, to make you happy. To give you the life you deserved. You gave me everything, Margaret said. Everything I needed and so much more. You gave me love, Daniel. Real love. The kind that lasts. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the world in deeper shades of red and purple. In the distance, they could hear their grandson calling to his sister, the sounds of another generation growing up in these mountains, learning to be strong and kind and true. I would do it all again, Daniel said suddenly. Every moment, every choice, every hardship. Because it all led here to you, to this life we built together. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. So would I, Margaret whispered. Even the hard parts, even the losses, because they led me to you. As darkness fell gently over the meadow, Daniel and Margaret made their way slowly back to the cabin. Their children and grandchildren were there waiting, ready to share a meal and stories and laughter. The cabin was full of light and warmth and love, filled to bursting with the family they had created together. That night, lying in bed beside her husband, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey her life had been. From the fire that stole her first family to the bullets that stole Thomas, to the moment Daniel rode into her life and changed everything. She had lost so much, survived so much, endured so much pain. But in the end, she had won. She had found happiness. She had built a life worth living. She had loved and been loved in return with a depth and permanence that nothing could shake. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness, knowing Daniel was still awake beside her. For what? He asked, his hand finding hers under the blankets. For everything, Margaret said. For giving me something no one could take away. For teaching me to live again. For loving me. Always, Daniel said simply. Always and forever. They drifted off to sleep together, as they had done for nearly 50 years, secure in their love and in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The mountain man and the woman who had lost everything twice. Two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and built something that would outlast them both. Their love story became legend in those mountains, passed down through generations. The tale of Margaret and Daniel, who found each other in the darkest of times and built a love that endured through everything life could throw at them. A love that started with tragedy but ended in triumph. A love that proved, beyond any doubt, that second chances are real and that hope is never truly lost. And in the meadow where wildflowers bloomed every spring, the bench Daniel built still stood, a monument to a love that transcended loss and pain. Generations of their descendants came to sit on that bench, to remember the story of the woman who lost everything twice and the mountain man who gave her something no one could ever take away. Love. Real, honest, enduring love. The kind that makes life worth living and gives meaning to even the hardest days. The kind that transforms tragedy into triumph and turns two broken people into something whole and beautiful and lasting. That was the legacy Margaret and Daniel left behind. Not wealth or fame or worldly success, but love. Pure and simple and eternal, and in the end that was everything that mattered.